You were the smart kid. So why do you feel so lost now? You were the smart kid. The one who always had the answers, who picked up new concepts faster than the others, who was praised for potential, intelligence, and talent. People told you that you were destined for great things, that the world would open up to you effortlessly, that your mind alone would be enough to carve out a meaningful and successful life. And yet, here you are lost. Not just unsure of your next step, but fundamentally disconnected from any sense of purpose. You feel like you should be further ahead than you are, like you're falling behind some invisible timeline that no one ever explicitly stated, but that you internalized nonetheless. You wonder why, despite being the person who was supposed to figure things out, you now feel like you understand less about yourself and your future than ever before. So what happened? How did the bright, curious child who once devoured books, solved complex problems, and impressed adults with their depth of thought end up feeling stuck, unsure, and maybe even deeply disillusioned? The answer is not as simple as life got harder or you lost motivation. The truth is, the very system that once rewarded your intelligence also set you up for this crisis. Because being the smart kid wasn't just an identity, it was a trap. From an early age, you were conditioned to believe that intelligence alone was the key to success. You were praised for your ability to absorb and regurgitate information, for your ability to solve puzzles, for your ability to excel within a structured environment. But what no one told you was that real life does not operate like a classroom. In school, there is always a correct answer, a grading system, a clear set of expectations. In life, there is none of that. There are no guaranteed rewards for intelligence, no automatic pathways to fulfillment, no external authority handing out gold stars for figuring things out. And because you were never taught how to navigate the uncertainty, how to persist without immediate validation, how to build a life outside of predefined structures, you now find yourself paralyzed.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
And then there's the perfectionism. The subtle but insidious belief that because you were always the smart one, you are not allowed to fail. That every choice you make must be the right one, that every action must be meaningful, that every step must lead to something greater. And so you hesitate, you overthink. You analyze every possibility, terrified of making a mistake, terrified of disappointing the version of yourself that everyone believed in. But in doing so, you remain stagnant. You convince yourself that you must wait for clarity before taking action, but clarity never comes from waiting, it comes from movement. But there's something even deeper at play here, something more unsettling. But what if the very idea of being the smart one was never really about you? What if it was an identity that was imposed on you, something that you internalized because it made you valuable in the eyes of others? What if, beneath that identity, there is a part of you that has been neglected, ignored, or even suppressed? Because intelligence, for all its advantages, can also be a shield, a way to detach from emotions, from intuition, from the messy, unpredictable nature of being human. And maybe, just maybe, part of why you feel lost now is because you are realizing that intelligence alone is not enough, and that logic and analysis, while powerful, do not provide meaning. That the deepest questions of life, who am I? What do I want? What makes life worth living? Cannot be answered with intellect alone. So here's the real question. If you were not the smart kid, if you were not defined by your ability to think, to solve, to achieve, who would you be? And more importantly, What would your life look like if you allowed yourself to exist outside of that label? The burden of potential, when being gifted, becomes a curse from a young age. You were told that you had something special, that your intelligence set you apart, that your potential was limitless, that you were meant for something greater. And at first, this felt like a gift. It made you feel important, capable, destined for success. But over time, that potential, the very thing that was supposed to empower you, began to feel like a weight. A silent, invisible pressure that followed you everywhere. Because when you are told that you are capable of great things, an unspoken expectation forms you must live up to it. And suddenly your intelligence is no longer a source of freedom, it becomes a cage. You start to measure your worth by what you achieve, by how much you accomplish, by whether or not you are living up to the expectations placed upon you. Every decision feels heavier because it is not just about what you want, it is about whether you are wasting your gifts, whether you are meeting the standards that others and eventually you yourself have set. And worst of all, the more you achieve, the higher the bar is raised. What was once impressive becomes expected. What was once celebrated becomes the bare minimum. Then you are no longer praised just for being smart, you are only valued when you prove it. And so you start chasing validation, not because you crave attention, but because you have been conditioned to believe that your worth is tied to your ability to perform. You become obsessed with making the right choices, with ensuring that every step you take leads to something meaningful, with avoiding failure at all costs. But this obsession does not lead to clarity, it leads to paralysis. Because when you believe that every decision is a reflection of your inherent value, the fear of making the wrong choice becomes overwhelming. You hesitate, you second guess, you overanalyze. You delay taking action, convincing yourself that you need more time, more certainty, more proof that you are on the right path. But deep down, you know the truth. You are not waiting for clarity. You are waiting for permission to fail. And that permission never comes. Because to fail would mean confronting the terrifying question you have spent your whole life avoiding. What if I am not as special as they said I was? What if all the praise, all the expectations, all the talk of potential was wrong? What if you are just ordinary? The thought is unbearable, not because being ordinary is bad, but because you have never been allowed to believe that it was an option. You were never taught that your worth exists outside of achievement, that your value is not something you must constantly prove. And so, instead of risking failure, you retreat. You stay in your comfort zone. You avoid challenges that might expose your limitations. You convince yourself that as long as you do nothing, you cannot disappoint anyone, including yourself. But here's the paradox. The very thing you fear, failing, being average, not meeting expectations, is already happening. Because by refusing to take risks, by avoiding discomfort, by staying trapped in the cycle of hesitation, you are not just failing to succeed, you are failing to live. You are stuck in a limbo where you are neither moving forward nor fully present in the moment. And the longer you stay here, the more disconnected you become, not just from your goals, but from yourself. So now, you must ask yourself a question that may feel impossible to answer. If you were not afraid of wasting your potential, if success and failure did not define you, what would you do? Not what is impressive, not what is expected, not what makes sense on paper, but what actually calls to you. Because maybe the real tragedy is not failing to meet expectations. Maybe the real tragedy is spending your life chasing an idea of success that was never truly yours. Escaping the identity trap. Why intelligence alone will never be enough for so long. you have been defined by your intelligence. It was the thing that made you stand out, the thing that set you apart, the thing that made you feel valuable. And yet, as you move through life, you are beginning to realize something unsettling. Intelligence alone is not enough. It does not automatically lead to success, to happiness, to fulfillment. It does not protect you from uncertainty, from doubt, from fear. It does not give you a sense of purpose. And now, without the structure of school, without the clear metrics of success that once made everything seem so simple, but you are left with a question that you do not know how to answer. Who am I, if I am not just the smart one? Because intelligence is not an identity. It is not a personality. It is not a substitute for self-awareness, for emotional depth, for lived experience. But when you have spent your entire life being defined by your mind, it is easy to mistake it for the whole of who you are. You have been conditioned to believe that thinking is your greatest strength, but what if it has also become your greatest limitation? What if, in relying so heavily on logic, on analysis, on intellectual superiority, you have neglected the parts of yourself that cannot be measured by IQ or academic achievement? What if, in your pursuit of knowledge, you have lost touch with wisdom? Because wisdom is not just about knowing, it is about understanding. It is about seeing beyond the surface of things, about recognizing the limits of intellect, about accepting that not everything in life can be solved like an equation. And this is where many smart kids struggle. Because they have been taught that their value lies in their ability to figure things out, they become uncomfortable with anything that cannot be neatly categorized, logically explained, or solved through sheer mental effort. But life does not operate on logic alone. It is messy, unpredictable, emotional. It requires intuition, resilience, adaptability. And these are qualities that intelligence alone does not provide. And so, you find yourself at a crossroads. On one side, there is the familiar path, the one where you continue to define yourself by your intellect, where you seek validation through achievement, where you cling to the idea that if you just think hard enough, you will eventually find all the answers. But deep down, you know where that path leads. It leads to more overthinking, more hesitation, more frustration. It leads to a life spent in your head, disconnected from your heart. On the other side, there is the unknown, the terrifying but necessary process of letting go of the identity that has defined you for so long. Not abandoning your intelligence, but no longer using it as a shield. No longer relying on it to give you a sense of worth. No longer believing that knowledge alone will save you from the discomfort of being human. And this path is difficult because it requires you to step into uncertainty without the safety net of always having the right answers. It requires you to accept that sometimes thinking is not the solution. Sometimes you have to feel. Sometimes you have to take risks. Sometimes you have to act before you are completely sure. But here is the truth: the people who create the most meaningful lives are not always the smartest. They are the ones who are willing to embrace the full spectrum of human experience. The ones who are willing to fail, to feel deeply, to step into the unknown. The ones who understand that intelligence is a tool, not an identity. And so, the real question is not how smart am I? It is how willing am I to live? Because at the end of your life, you will not measure your existence by how much you knew. You will measure it by how much you experienced, by how deeply you connected, by how boldly you pursued what mattered to you, by how fully you allowed yourself to be alive. And that is something no amount of intelligence can guarantee. That is something only you can choose. Reclaiming yourself, how to find meaning beyond intelligence. At some point, you have to make a choice. You can continue clinging to the idea that intelligence alone will give your life meaning, or you can step beyond it and start building something real. Because if there is one truth that many smart kids struggle to accept, it is this: being intelligent is not an achievement. It is not something you did, not something you earned. It is simply an attribute, like height or eye color. Yes, it can be an advantage. Yes, it can open doors. But intelligence on its own does not create happiness, fulfillment, or purpose. It is only what you do with it that matters. And if you spend your life using your mind as a shield to avoid discomfort, failure, or uncertainty, then what is the point of having it at all? So where do you go from here? How do you move forward when your entire sense of identity has been wrapped around something that no longer feels like enough? The answer is not in thinking more, analyzing harder, or searching for some grand intellectual revelation that will suddenly make everything clear. The answer is in action, in experience, in stepping outside the safety of your own mind and into the reality of life itself. Because the truth is, you do not think your way into meaning, you live your way into it. And this means embracing discomfort. It means allowing yourself to fail, not as something to be feared, but as something that is necessary for growth. It means recognizing that you will never have all the answers, that certainty is an illusion, and that the only way to truly understand yourself is to try, to experiment, to do. You cannot think your way into confidence, into purpose, into fulfillment. You have to build them, brick by brick, through real, tangible experiences. It also means shifting your definition of success. Because for most of your life, success has been about performance grades, achievements, external validation. But real success is not about meeting expectations that were placed upon you as a child. It is about creating a life that actually feels right to you. And maybe that means pursuing something unconventional. But maybe that means stepping away from the rigid structure that once made you feel safe. Maybe it means redefining what it means to live up to your potential, not as something measured by external accomplishments, but as something measured by how fully you engage with the world. And perhaps most importantly, it means reconnecting with yourself beyond the label of the smart one. Because intelligence is not your identity. It is not the most interesting thing about you. You are not just a mind, you are a person. You are a person with emotions, with desires, with instincts that cannot always be explained or rationalized. And the more you allow yourself to exist outside of intellectual performance, the more you will start to discover who you actually are. So ask yourself, what would I do if I were not afraid of disappointing others? What would I pursue if I did not feel the need to be exceptional? Who would I be if I let go of the pressure to always have the right answer? Because maybe, just maybe, the real answer is not something you have to think your way toward. Maybe it is something you have to become, and that is the journey. Not one of proving your intelligence, not one of living up to some abstract idea of potential, but one of discovering what truly makes you come alive. And that is something no test, no title, no external validation can ever define for you. That is something only you can choose.